All right. So, hello, everybody. Good evening and good morning to some of you. I'm Shiwali Mohan. I'm a principal scientist at the Palo Alto Research Center. It's a small research company that's based in California, in Palo Alto. And I don't know if you have ever visited the Bay Area, but it's in the company is in a very nice part of Palo Alto over the hills and looks over to the bay. So that's the best part of working at Park. And the second best part is obviously doing interesting research. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss this with you. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. Uh, they're my social media handles. Feel free to write to me. My email is also on my website or towards the end of my talk. So I always love to interact with students. So if you have questions, concerns, just want feedback on things, please feel free to reach out. All right, so let's dive in. Okay, so let's first start with the problem. So I said that we are building systems that can do interactive task learning. So what is it and why do we want to do interactive task learning? Right, so you must have been on top of news of Google's robot trying to do household tasks. Amazon has now created its own fleet of home robots. So I think the world is moving towards a direction where robots are going to occupy human spaces, right? And this is very different from the old school factory robots that were in assembly lines and they were doing the same task over and over again. If you have robots in human spaces are dynamic, right? They're constantly changing. We cannot, it doesn't follow a fixed schedule. There are a lot of people that live there, right? So the world is very complex for a robot to live in, right? And every home is different. Everyone has different preferences, right? So the traditional way you would think about programming or training an intelligent agent like a robot doesn't really work in this scale, because if you you would have to imagine all the possible use cases in your deployment, program or train your system to do all of it, and then send it to someone's home. The question is, what happens if the training that you did or the design that was built doesn't really apply in the context of that specific person's home, right? What happens then? Like, do you then bring robot engineers back, the entire robotics team, and it retrains that robot? That's very costly. Do you send the robot back and bring the solution there, like the knowledge authoring burden there is pretty large, right? So there's one design hypothesis that some of us are following, which is, well, we should design these intelligent systems so that they enable non-human experts to program them, right? So you want natural instruction, you want diagrams, you want all the different ways humans teach each other to be used by humans to teach the robot, right? And if we can grok that problem, then this whole issue of, well, how do you get robots to do new things that are specific for this user, like that knowledge authoring burden is gone away, because you can rely on the user or the human themselves to then program the system. And they're the experts of that environment, right? They live there, they have certain needs of the robot. So that's the context of the problem as to why we want to build these systems. The problem itself is called interactive task learning, right? So sometimes in the literature, you will see things like end user programming, and that puts most of the onus on the human or the user who's doing the programming act. Interactive task learning sort of turns it around and puts more of the focus on the artificial intelligence system and says, well, it has to learn from what the human is talking about or human is trying to teach. But they're both, the two sides of the exact same coin. So in 2017, scientists from very different fields got together to define what interactive task learning should even be, right? So there were people from machine learning, cognitive architectures, robotics, psychology, computational linguistics, and the output of that 3-day workshop was this book that defines what the problem is, what are the current challenges in developing such systems, and how we can move forward. And you would, as we go through this talk, you will realize there's no chat GPT here, So this is very different kind of research, but hopefully it's still interesting, right? Like the systems like ChatGPT and large language models, they have taken up a lot of conversational and scientific discussion space, but they are designed for a specific use case, right? So we are trying to figure out, well, what happens if we use methods for this specific use case? All right, so let's start with an ideal learning system, right? So what is it that we really want to build? So this is my friend's son. His name is Ishan, and he's interacting with his nanny. And you'll see like how this interaction unfolds, right? So the nanny asks him to do some tasks, and then he just doesn't know how to do them, right? So I'll just play this, and then I'll pause, and then I'll talk again, right? Okay. And this is from the nanny's perspective. She's recording the video.
Put it on your head. Ooh, good try. Try again. On your head, on your head. Put it on your head. Go ahead. Ooh, good try again. Good try, but you're missing your head. You gotta put it here on your head. You wanna try again? You need help? Help? Okay, I can help.
So there's a lot of interesting things to note about this interaction, right? So the agent, or Ishan, is trying to learn. He's trying to learn a control skill that will, help him put the hat on his head. But he doesn't really, like, he can't reach it. He doesn't know how to exactly do that, right? So his nanny is giving him continuous feedback as he's trying to act out what he's intending to do. And she even gives him more corrective feedback, like head, it means here. And so so there's a lot of back and forth, right? He's looking at the nanny, he's looking for more information because he's unable to do the task. And then eventually, once he realizes that he's just totally unsuccessful, he actually asks for help, right? So this is the kind of learning we really want the robot to do. We want the robot to not only consume information that it's getting from the human, but also apply it in its own environment. And then it fails, it actually goes back and asks for more information and build and sort of learns through this interactive process. And this is very different from how, a classical machine learning setup operates, right? Classical machine learning setup operates in this train test kind of a way, that you first train the system, then you go ahead and then you try it on certain test cases. And if it doesn't work, you just go back to training. But in an interactive learning system, there's no such distinction between these phases. You have to train as you are being tested, right? So this is what would be an online kind of learning experience, right? Interactive task learning is active, right? So you actively apply all the knowledge that you have to the current task. And if you fail, then you know that that's your opportunity to learn. And this is very different from, again, classical machine learning, where the system has no idea when it's learning, or when it's failing, when it's good, when its behavior is good, when it's bad. It's the programmer who looks at the behavior of the system, recognizes where the system lacks knowledge, and then retrains it. So we want the system to be intelligent enough about its own lack of knowledge. Usually there's going to be small data, again, there's not going to be trillion tokens in your training set, because humans are giving highly salient, structured information that you really have to leverage, right? There's not going to be a lot of different ways in which you can wear your hat, and you have the luxury to sit and just like process all of this information and figure out the right way to doing it, right? Another assumption that's different from a classical machine learning setup is that we assume that there is a teacher who's helpful to the learner, right? The teacher is trying to train the learner. The teacher is trying to help the learner get to the right task execution or right behavior. And again, this is very different from classical machine learning, where you want to get as much data as possible, because then you can get rid of all the confounds, and you can get to the general pattern that applies, right? So the interactive task learning paradigm turns the learning onto its head, at least coming from the AI side. Now I know most of you are psychology students, so to you that's not a big thing. This is how people learn. This is how all learning should happen. But the AI side tends to think of in a more classic machine learning side, right? So as a note, I wanted to also highlight that there is a DARPA program called SAIL-ON, which is looking at, again, trying to define what this kind of learning would be. So they call it open world learning for novelty aware agents. So these are agents that are given an unknown novelty, an unknown situation to handle that was not part of their training set. So now they have to first recognize, okay, I'm in a novel condition, understand what this novelty is, and then learn about that novelty, right? And that's more human-like learning, and that's where we are trying to build towards. Okay. So the work I'm going to describe comes from this, family of research that was done in Soar cognitive architecture. So it started around 2012. It's been 10 years, and we are slowly making progress, improving on the agents, giving them new capabilities, understanding different parts of the architecture that are required to be able to do something like interactive task learning. Right. So this talk focuses on two different papers that I'm an author on and were done at Park. So one is the more human-centered part of it. So before we can design agents that can learn interactively from humans, we have to first understand, well, how is it that humans teach, right? Because if we understand how or what is the property of human instruction, we can design the learning agent to really exploit that structure. Right, so that's the first part of my talk. The second part of the talk is more robot-centric or more AI-centric, which is, well, how can a robot learn from, natural human teaching and again, like this is a different paradigm, right? I'm not treating human teaching as labeled data sets that I'm going to infer certain things over. Now we are going to dive a little bit deep. So, and so that we are able to learn something about humans as we build this project. All right, so unpacking human teaching. So this was like I said, was the question that we asked, like, how do humans teach? This work was led by Preeti Ramraj, who's a graduate student at University of Michigan, so your close neighbor. So one thing to note, and we've talked about it earlier, right, that human teaching happens in an interactive context. You are not only interacting in the world, but you're also interacting with a teaching entity that cares about your learning, right? So I like to show this example of this little boy who is with his father, and they're playing Blocks World together, right? And it's through this experience that the boy is going to learn a whole lot of things like color recognition, shape recognition, movement, how to think about the concept of stability, right? So you're learning a lot of what would be called common sense knowledge about the world in this interactive environment. And that's our goal, right? We want our agents to work with human instructors, human teachers, as they're embodied in their environment, and then extract useful knowledge from that interaction, right? Okay, so this study was done in 2020, when just as COVID started. And so Preeti was very nifty with the study. So she designed this entire study to be conducted on Zoom. So we used a robotic simulator to then set up different scenes. And then she played the role of an agent, and she had participants join the Zoom call, and she had interactions with them about the task they were supposed to teach the robot, right? So the task was that you have to teach the robot to build a wall, right? So this is an example of a wall. So there were a set of objects that were given to the participants, and the robot had to try build a wall that looks like that. So we told the participants that the wall has to be multicolored, multi-shape, and can be of any length. Right. And that was the instruction we gave. We didn't tell them, oh, you have to, tell the robot that this is blue. You have to tell the robot that this is touching or that's a straight line. We just said, no, this is what a wall looks like. You have to teach the robot how to get there. And then Preeti generated a script that she followed. So anytime the human would say something, she would use the script to generate an answer to the human so that they could advance to the next instruction, right? So these were 10 participants. You could think of it as a semi-structured interview study. These people were from different backgrounds, and they also have varied understanding of how robots learn. And we recorded video, audio, and transcripts. So I wanted to show you what the video actually looks like. I will have to find that. Apologies. I thought I had already pulled up the video. Okay.
Are cubes.
I have learned examples of cubes.
Okay. Robot, these objects are green.
I have learned examples of green.
Robot, this is a wall.
I have learned another example of a wall.
Robot, the green cone is left of the green cube.
I have learned an example of left off.
Robot, can you move the green cylinder left of the green cone?
Okay, I'm taking control of the mouse. Done.
Robot, can you tell me what you've built?
This is a green wall.
Robot, this is a red, blue, and green wall.
I have learned an example of red, blue, and green wall.
Robot, can you make a red, blue, and green wall?
Okay, I am taking control of the mouse.
Okay, I'll pause here. So the robot, or Preeti pretending to be a robot, goes ahead and builds the wall that the instructor desires, right? So that's what the interaction looked like, and that's the data that we collected. And then we did a qualitative data analysis to understand, well, what happened in this interaction. And it was a bidirectional analysis, right? In top-down analysis, we had certain hypotheses about what's true of human teacher, and you can look up the details in the paper itself. It was published at a human robot interaction conference. So the top-down analysis, we had certain hypotheses going in. Well, the hypotheses were things like, well, the human, probably structures the information based on different concepts in the domain ontology, right? So if there's objects on the scene, the human is going to teach about the objects. So those were the kind of hypotheses we already had. In the bottom-down analysis, we coded the data up. So we had a coding scheme, we coded the data up, and we tried to see, well, what themes emerged, and then we aligned them with the hypotheses. So I'll go over the findings, and these are very interesting, right? And I don't know, and I would love to learn with a discussion with all of you who are coming at it from the psychology side. From an AI perspective, these were very interesting, only because the AI side of science is, think of human instruction or human language as data to then learn properties of, right? That's the view that AI or machine learning sciences have. But what we found was that there's more structure to that instruction, right? So people naturally broke down the complex task and taught component concepts. So you saw the instructor try to say, well, these are the blocks, this is a green block. So she was trying to get the robot to understand the distinctions between different shapes. Then she went into spatial spatial knowledge that this is left off. And then she, connected these concepts together in the concept of a wall, right? That just came out naturally. This was not the instruction that was given to the participant. So this is how humans naturally teach. Like, we want to first break the task down into simple concepts. Then we want to introduce the simple concepts, iterate over those, and then like get to a more complex concept, right? So we saw that structure unfold even in this, roboticsy task. There were multiple modalities used, right? So she was pointing, the instructor was trying to point to where the robot should be looking to get relevant information. And, she was speaking as she was pointing to. And one of the most interesting finding was that, like, you must have noticed that she was not just, giving robot information. She was also trying to test what the robot knew, right? So she set up a wall and she said, well, what did you think you've built? And then she also tried to test if the robot knew a concept of a wall by asking the robot to build a wall, right? So the teacher is not just providing information for the system to learn from, but also is trying to evaluate through interactions how much the system actually knows. And this is very important because unless you probe for more information, you cannot diagnose what the system knows and doesn't know and why, and then you cannot provide real or right information or right structure. So humans, again, do this very naturally. Right. And then we also saw almost a curriculum just fall out of this experience, right? She had first thought about, well, I'll teach the objects first, then I'll teach relationships, then I'll show examples of walls, then I'll show an example of a single color wall, then I'll show example of a multicolor wall, then I'll try to get the robot to actually build things. So she had organized all these interactions in a curriculum plan that she was following, and then she was adapting online. So I don't think it's very surprising to psychology, and actually we got these ideas as we're studying cognitive sciences findings on how do teachers teach in a classroom. It was cool to see the same things just fall out in a more human robot interaction setting, right? And then we saw a lot of variation in teaching itself. So first variation is just people are very interactive. They're responding to a robot's failures and they're trying to get it to do the right thing, right? Different people have different teaching styles and adopted different curricula. So the example that we saw was more interactive, right? So let's do fun thing first, and then do the second thing later. We also had examples of people who had a more demonstrative style of teaching. So they would do the things as they are explaining them, and then expecting the robot to learn from that information. And then people also brought their background assumptions to teaching, which is something we hadn't predicted, but we should have. And what was interesting was people who had experience with coding or programming were the worst at following our protocol at teaching the robot successfully. And the reason was that they tried to get the robot to run subroutines, basically. So they said, well, let's declare a variable called A, right? So they were using the bias because they knew that it's a robot, it's following that, the interviewer is following a robot script. So they assume that that it would understand natural descriptions of programs, which we hadn't really designed our script for. The interactive examples were the ones, so people who did not have any programming background, so like the participant you just saw, actually was more natural, right? So she was relying on a more natural technique. She was trying to give more examples and demonstrations and other such data, right? So this was interesting. So it sets up some desiderata for if you have to design a robot that can consume most of the structure that humans naturally provide about certain tasks, then you have to think of certain algorithms and you have to put them in a certain structure, right? So we want the algorithms to leverage the structure that is in human teaching, right? So if humans break down tasks into smaller components and then put them together, the agent should be able to do that too. Like it should learn knowledge in a very compositional fashion, right? Then we saw that there was multiple modalities of information that was being provided. So that just tells us that means we need to have a common substrate that brings all that information together in a single representation, right? Teachers had different intentions. Like we said, that sometimes she was showing examples, sometimes she was asking questions. So the robot has to understand what the intention is and provide the right information, right? So that the instructor can revise their instruction based on what the robot's answer is. So you have to be cognizant of why someone is asking certain question. And then you have to provide a meaningful response based on what you already know, right? So this sets up some constraints over how the system would operate. So I'm planning to move on to the robotic side of things. I can pause here and see if there are any questions, if I could clarify some things. Okay, no questions. Hopefully that means that things are clear and not that people are sleeping. All right. So now I'm going to talk about a intelligent system that can hopefully consume the type of information humans provide and engage in that kind of an interaction. And we cannot cover yet the full space of, variability in human teaching, but we can process some types of information in the human teaching example, right? So as we developed this project, one of the things that was immediately obvious to us that we really needed to solve was to connect natural language that was being, used to provide information with conceptual knowledge that you might have about the world and grounding that in what you're observing, right? So all those three things have to happen in tandem for the agent to actually be able to learn, right? So part of this work was done on the DARPA Gala program, which was an interesting program. So it was trying to ask, where does meaning come from? Where does meaning in language come from, right? And different parts of AI and machine learning sciences have given us different answers to where could meaning come from in computational systems, right? So if you look at NLP research, so that would be BERT or the different variations of GPT, they derive meaning from statistical patterns in word usage, right? So they're learning over large knowledge sets or large sets of NLP documents, and they're trying to discover patterns in how humans use language. And then they use those patterns to then and those patterns are actually those word meanings, right? So when it's generating language, it's relying on patterns to generate the next word. Right, so that meaning is actually connected to the statistical pattern or the statistical usage of words in certain constructions. There's another set that's more lies between computer vision and natural language processing. So stable diffusion is an example of that kind of computation. Is they derive meaning from, again, from statistical inference, from pattern recognition, but they are pairing it up with visual stimulus with linguistic stimulus, right? So usually there will be a scene and there would be a description of that scene, and you're trying to learn the correlation patterns between what is, shown on the image versus what's being said. Right, but none of those are actually very useful if we go in a more agent setting that's interactive, right? And the answer for that is true. So say you are in the state which is shown in panel 1, and the instructor says, move the green sphere onto the red cube, right? So you have to now actually reason about how these words map onto your visual scene, right? So green sphere already exists on the scene, the red cube does, but onto does not exist. That you actually have to take certain actions to establish that predicate in the state, right? So it's not entailed by this scene. So if we went with GLP techniques, we wouldn't know how to interpret onto in context of this current state. And then same with move, like move is communicating information about a sequence of actions that now you have to connect together to be able to achieve the state that's described in the sentence. And again, that's not really in your visual scene, right? So when we are in an agent setting, we don't really have access to entire information either in language or in vision, but we actually have to connect it to action. We have to connect it to spatial understanding, goal-oriented action, and other concepts that are necessary for an agent's operation in the world, right? So the theories that exist didn't really apply for our setting. So we went to our roots and started looking at, well, how do psychologists talk about how humans use language in an embodied setting. And I've always been very inspired by Lawrence Barslow's work. And I don't know if you have read his to me, it's a seminal paper on psychology where he makes this claim that language originated for humans to engage in coordinated action, right? So it didn't originate so that we could write a lot of documents and then put them in libraries. That he said that that's a byproduct of our linguistic capability. Language actually existed because the hunter-gatherer society had to operate as teams to then go access food, build shelter, and things like that, right? So the groups of people would get together, and then now they had to achieve alignment and agreement on, well, what is it that they're going to do and what would happen if they did action A, right? So they really needed to communicate about actions and figure out a common ground and a common plan. And that was what drove communication and our linguistic capability. So then there's this hypothesis, it's called the indexical hypothesis, that follows from Lawrence Barslow's claim on embodied language. And the hypothesis states that humans use language referentially in service of collaborative action, right? So what language is trying to do is to drive my attention to the relevant parts of my state, things that I'm currently looking at, and the knowledge that I have, and it's bringing all of those components together in working memory. And then it's telling me, so like the grammatical constraints are telling me how to put those parts together so that I can execute an action, right? So all of this work is on using language as a way to understand action and execute action successfully. So there was so the rest of the work will focus on, well, what does it mean to connect language with concepts that you may not have? And then, because this is an analogical mind seminar, how can an analogy help us in bridging the gap between language and vision and action, right? So we have, and we're using a analogical reasoning and generalization engine that was developed at Northwestern. It's called Structure Mapping Engine, and its follow-on systems to then show that if we build an agent in certain ways, then we can show that the agent can understand language in the way I described. Okay, so I don't know if all of you know cognitive architectures, but I still wanted to talk about them a little bit. So cognitive architectures are architectures that allow us to build intense cognitive models. The interesting part about it is that they aim to explain the entire complexity of human intelligence, right? So these are not cognitive models of visual processing or cognitive models of memory, but they put all of those smaller cognitive models together in a single architecture, because if you have to study human cognition in its entire complexity, you actually have to build these complex systems to get to some very specific hypotheses and validate them and evaluate them. From the AI side, they're very useful to build intelligent agents. So they're cool. Like, you don't have to write every intelligent agent from scratch. You can start with a cognitive architecture, and they have certain natural properties that have been built into them that you can use. So I'm going to skip this slide a little bit. Okay, so the AILEEN project uses two cognitive architectures, right? So we use Soar. You can think of, I guess I will talk about this a little bit. So you could think of Soar as a task performance architecture. So that's its main strength. It can do sophisticated goal-oriented reasoning. It can split a complex goal into simpler goals, organize them, and then execute them. And it can use a lot of contextual information to figure out which sub goal to address first. So this came out of the problem solving research that was done by Herb Simon and Alan Newell, and then John Laird at University of Michigan, right? So you could think of this as a task performance model. What SOAR lacks, though, is a complex conceptual reasoning system, right? So it doesn't really think about abstractions. It doesn't really or at least the theory doesn't say a whole lot about how humans build representations and how do we evaluate if something is similar to other, right? So it just, operates on graphical structures, and it just is focused on task performance. So what it lacks, companions have. So companions is an architecture that was developed by Northwestern University in your CS department. And what it does is it is a very strong theory on representation and reasoning with complex representation. So, right, how do we know that two things are similar or different, right? How do we know what we can infer given some parts of that representation, right? So it's more intense. So what we did for AILEEN was we brought these two cognitive architecture theories together and combined it with the modern methods for computer vision, inverse kinematics for robotic control, to then actually build an end-to-end system that can go from vision and language and then do the entire reasoning chain, right? So the system is set up as so. We have a trainer. So you can have a human trainer, or you could have a scripted trainer, and that way we can design various instruction scripts with certain hypotheses in them and see if the agent can learn from that, right? So that's the trainer part. The right side of it is the learner part. So that's the agent that's built with cognitive architectures and has instantiations of several cognitive models into it. And the agent and the trainer are interacting with each other in two channels, right? So one is the environment channel, the environment or the situation channel. So the trainer can go ahead and change the environment, and so can the agent. And then there's the interaction channel. So this instructor can like describe things or ask the agent to do something. That's the interaction channel, right? So that's how they are communicating. So that's how they are transferring information. The trainer doesn't get to go in and change the representations of the system. The representations are whatever naturally come out of different cognitive theories that have been built into this architecture, right? The only thing the trainer can really change is either the natural language part or the scene, right? So this is very similar to how a human parent might interact with a child. They're just working with changing the world, setting different blocks up, and then working with the child to do certain tasks. So that's why we constrain this interaction to be so. And again, this work was done with Will Hancock, who's a PhD student at Northwestern University CS department, with Ken Forbes. And he was at Park on an internship, and he helped develop and build parts of the system, right? Okay, so how does the system work? So again, it's an online system. It's in a continuous loop with the world. There's a camera, a simulated camera that's looking at the tabletop from the top, and it takes pictures. It's continuously taking pictures in cycles. From that picture, we apply deep vision techniques to then extract and localize different objects on the scene. And then we also extract certain symbols that may correspond to its shape, size, whatever. But the agent has no idea what these symbols are, right? So the deep vision would just say, okay, I'm seeing three objects. Object one has symbol CV5, right? That's what the deep vision component is doing. Then all of these objects, they're localized, the centroids of their localization, all of that is fed into the qualitative spatial reasoning library, and it's going from the metric information and it's extracting some symbolic calculi out of it, right? So it's doing things like, well, is object one to the north of object two, right? So it's extracting that kind of situational information from the scene. Then we go into source task reasoning system. So the reasoning system is thinking about, okay, my current state looks so, my goal is that I have that, object one has to be an object two. So what should I do next? So it's reasoning about what action to take. And then once it has determined an action, it comes back through the qualitative spatial reasoning layer, and then it goes into inverse kinematics. So this is, if I have to move the robot's hand to this point in space, how exactly would I change the voltage of the motors, right? And then once you know those voltage of the motors, you can apply it on the robot, and the robot executes the action, right? So this is what I believe is very similar to, or at least analogous to, how human cognitive system operates, right? You have these different representations at different levels that you're using to reason about different parts of the task, right? So your eyes and the related visual neurons are looking at objects, segmenting them, assigning certain properties to them, and then your representation builds. At some point you would, given certain intention, you would want to pick something up or change something. At that point, your hands and your motor movements start making sense. So in my mind, this is like a AI or a computational analog to how humans operate in an embodied setting, but it's greatly minimized, greatly simplified. Humans are much more complex. Right, so that's loop number one. The loop number two is through the interaction channel, right? So there's something said, I have to first, assign some or extract some structure from these tokens that I'm seeing. So this could be something like, oh, green is a noun, green is an adjective, cylinder is a noun, things like that, right? So you're extracting some structure. You're also monitoring what the intent of the instructor is. Is the instructor asking me a question? Is it the instructor asking me, is there a green sphere on the scene, or is the instructor trying to tell me that there's a green sphere on the scene? So that intent is processed. Then the remainder of the system is looking at, okay, what does green mean, right? And it's looking up its concept memory, which is built with structure mapping engine and Sage. It's trying to think, have I experienced green before? Let me try to look up that experience and let me see if that experience matches what I'm seeing. And if it does, let me elaborate my current perception and say, well, this specific object is green, right? So it's using its concept memory to then figure out, organize its experience, and then figure out which part of this experience actually applies as it's trying to comprehend the instruction. So we can ground this out a little bit more. And this might get a little dense, so please stop me if you're not understanding. Okay, so this is the shared environment, right? Let's say the instructor said, move green sphere onto the red cube, right? This is the instruction. And this is what the current scene looks like. There are three objects, right? They're localized in space through the deep vision algorithm. And in addition, the deep vision algorithm has also extracted certain symbols corresponding to them, right? These symbols are not meaningful. They are just like, okay, detection A, detection CVS4, right? These are not meaningful detections, but they're consistent. They're talking about a specific property of the object, right? That it's a shape property. Again, and then the qualitative spatial reasoning extraction is extracting symbols, relational symbols between these objects. So here the system is saying, well, these two objects are disconnected. So the two green objects are disconnected. And the green cylinder is to the north of the yellow sphere, right? So those are the symbols that are being extracted, and it describes the current scene. This is represented as a graph in source working memory. So this is source current representation, or AILEEN's, the agent's current representation of what happens on the scene, right? And lexical processing has produced, that there's nouns. It has certain rules that helps it process the instruction. So rules would be something like, well, there's nouns, there are sphere, cube, cylinder, there's properties of object, they're red and green. And that object reference is usually a sequence of properties followed by its name, right? So that's what it exists. There exists a certain set of rules that apply to the scene. And the system can learn rules too, but I'm not going to talk about that part in this talk because we're focusing mostly on language. Okay. In any case, so you have information coming from the lexical processing part. You have information from what the scene looks like. And what the problem that the system is trying to solve is, well, I have to interpret green sphere. That means I have to focus my attention on this right object, which translates to, okay, which part of my graph here actually corresponds to this object reference, right? This is the problem that the agent has to solve. And to solve this problem, the agent uses its concept memory, right? So let's look at the concept memory a little bit. So at this point, the concept memory has two collections of experiences, right? So we have a set of experiences that correspond to the word green, and we have a set of experiences that correspond to the word sphere, and they are separated and they live in that, you know, database or memory. So what the system then makes a query to its concept memory, and it's saying, is there an object that satisfies, or that is a sphere type object given what I'm seeing in my scene graph and the experiences that I have had with the concept sphere, right? So it's asking this question to its concept memory. It's saying, given this current graph and all the experience that I have corresponding to the concept green, can you assert green in this current situation, right? That's what the query the system asks of its own concept memory. And what the underlying structure mapping engine does is that it will compare the graph that corresponds to the experience corresponding to the word sphere. It looks at the subgraph of what it's looking at. It's trying to establish a match, right? It's trying to see how similar these two graphs are. And if that similarity crosses a threshold, then you know that you can assert it, right? So you can assert, so if this part of the graph was very similar to what my experience captured the concept sphere as, then I know that I can assert sphere here, right? So it elaborates the graph. It says, okay, this is the object that's sphere. That means that the agent can start focusing on this part of the graph because it's relevant for the next set of instructions that are going to come in, right? So that's how, so going back to a little bit about similarities, this is what analogical reasoning is, right? So analogical reasoning is trying to establish similarity between the past experience that the agent has had and the generalized knowledge it might have extracted from it with what it's currently seeing. So it's establishing an analogy. And if that analogy is highly scored, then I'm asserting it in my current, in my working memory. So imagine, so now let's look at, so this was the case where there was an experience that, or there were a set of experiences in the agent's concept memory that corresponded to sphere, right? But what happens if the instructor uses a word that you have no new concept of? So you have no experience that's associated with that concept, right? So let's study that. So what's going to happen is when I try to look up my concept memory and say, well, can you tell me something about move? The concept memory will fail. It would say, well, I don't have anything. This is new to me, right? So this is again the start of an interactive learning cycle. And this is why it's important for the agent to be able to recognize when its knowledge sources or when its current knowledge is incomplete in context of what it's being asked to do, right? Because if you fail, you can go and ask for more information, which is how the system learns anyways. So the system learns through demonstration. And without going into too much details of what the demonstration is, what would happen is the system asks the teacher to show an example of move, and it stores away that experience. So let's look at, maybe this is the 3 different states that were experienced as the instructor was trying to demonstrate move, right? So the first state is that the objects are separate. The second state is that then something is holding the object up. And the third state is that the objects are in a desired configuration, right? So these are the 3 different states in the experience. Those different states applied with different objects. So this experience itself is a graph, which then is stored in the agent's concept memory, right? So that's experience number 1. So you have stored that graph. And that graph was generated as you were processing the instructor's demonstration. Now imagine if you kept on seeing different demonstrations for move, right? So the first demonstration of move that you'll see, you'll only learn it in context of this current state, right? You only learn moving green sphere to the red cube because that was a demonstration given, and you had no way to infer a general structure from that one demonstration, right? But the next time around, the same thing would happen. Someone would ask you to move a yellow cylinder on top of the red box, and you would fail again because your experience doesn't really match. It doesn't entail the assertion that's required. So you would fail again and you would ask for another demonstration. So the instructor would give another set of demonstration corresponding to the word move, and slowly the analogical generalization process in SAGE starts to basically generalize away structure that's just incidental to your experience, right? So that someone taught you moving with this green colored object, that's just incidental. That's not a definition of move. That's just incidental to the demonstration that you were given. So the more examples you accumulate, the more you are able to throw away the incidental information and keep the important structure, right? So the relationship that you're picking up the object, that's the first argument, that's important. So that's retained. And then the relationship that you're placing an object on something else. So the onto relationship is important. That predicate is important. That's retained. But every other incidental thing is thrown away by the generalization algorithm. All right. So I guess I'm running close to my time limit. Or maybe I have another 10 minutes or so. Okay. So let's talk about evaluation a little bit. So how would we evaluate such a system? And usually it's a challenge, right? Like if you are well versed in AI terminology, the way to look at and a intelligent system or a machine learning system is to look at accuracy of a classifier, right? Can I classify different categories represented in my data set correctly? In interactive learning systems, that's not what you could do because the accuracy, there's no real definition of accuracy. The system is continuously learning. So what we really want to show is how the system learns and what are the properties of its learning, and as it's creating more conceptual knowledge within itself. So there are three metrics that we looked at as we were training these systems. The first one was that is the agent active, or is this agent intelligent enough? Is this agent learning only when it's needed, right? Because that's one of the power of interactive learning systems, that they're continuously applying the knowledge that they have, right? So they only need examples that are important or salient for them to learn or to distinguish between concepts. And once it has learned a good conceptualization, it doesn't need more examples, right? So we need to learn, we want to measure how many examples or how many interactive sessions you need for this agent to learn a concept. The second thing is obviously how quickly it can learn a general representation of concept, because it learns from super specific to super general, and an intelligent agent would be able to learn very quickly. And then the second thing that happens sometimes in concept learning systems is that you just learn an overgeneral representation of concepts. So every object that I see is a cube. So you want to track that, like, is there conceptual bleed that's happening between different concepts it's learning, because it's a single system that's learning all the concepts that can be defined in this in the tabletop world that it lives. So we constructed a set of trials, which was, first we would give the agent an example, right? So I would show an agent, here's a green cone. And after I have shown this example, I'll give it an exam. I'll give it an exam that measures how general this concept definition it has is. And then I'll also measure if its concept is bleeding onto other concepts, right? So this was the sequence of exams. So you would see in the results, you would see different examples that were provided with teaching. And after every teaching, we see how good the concept representation is, right? So here's an example. So I'm looking at the top graph here. On the y-axis, you are seeing how much training or how many examples the agent needs to learn a concept. And it's in this particular experiment, it's trying to learn the visual concept. So these are colors and shapes. And now we have an extension that can also do sizes, which has similar properties, right? On the y-axis, you're seeing a few different things. First, you're seeing how many back and forth interaction the agent needs to successfully recognize the instruction. The pink graph shows how general its concept representation is. Can it detect all true positives, right? Can it detect all cones as cones, right? That's what the exam is. That's what this line is showing. And then the green line is showing, the green line is trying to capture the false positives, right? So it's saying, well, if I show it a sphere, will it think it's a cone, right? So that's what these three things are showing. And so we see good properties of such learning, right? That first, it's very active as it starts to build a good conceptualization of different visual concepts. It stops needing information. So, right, by default, it stops asking for that information because now it knows what that concept is. And correspondingly, the green line never goes below the maximum score here, right? So that shows, well, the concept bleed in the visual concepts is not really happening. It can learn distinct conceptual representations for different visual concepts, right? So this is an ideal graph from a system. This is what we want to see. We ran another experiment for spatial concepts. So these are concepts like right off, left off, on top of, and things like that. And the way we tested generality was with distractor objects, right? So if I showed you an example of left off, so yellow cone is to the left of the red cylinder, and you learned from it, and then I introduced distractor objects and asked you to recognize the spatial relationship between the yellow cone and the red cylinder, are you still able to do it? Like, are you letting information from other objects confuse your understanding of the concepts, right? So the exams contain distractor objects, and we're seeing similar performance, right? It's a little bit harder because this is a higher order predicate, right? You are trying to learn spatial relationships between two objects. So the vocabulary is much larger, and there's some noise that comes in because you might have some confounds with other spatial concepts. But in any case, it does grow. It still has the same behavior, that it stops asking for information as it gains more experience and it has a good understanding of the concept, and then no false positives. And then we tested in a similar fashion actions, right? So we give it a demonstration and then we see if it can recognize other demonstrations. And again, a similar pattern, but we also see that learning in action is much harder. There's more of a conceptual bleed that's going on between actions, and the conceptual the concept formation is not as general or as strong as it was for visual concepts. And this all follows from Dedre's work, right? Like she said, verbs are much harder to learn. And the reason is that you have to not only learn the visual concepts, the spatial concepts, but you also have to distinguish the manner of action, the final goal that you're trying to do with actions or verbs. So we are seeing that in data. Like if we design a system that's human-like in its learning, we would expect that actions would be harder to learn, and the experiment shows that. And then we ran the full experiment that the human participant study was looking at, like, can the agent learn a concept of a wall? And we are seeing similar effects, right? So once we have learned different blocks, different shapes, different sizes, you can learn blocks. You can learn complex objects, composite objects like walls. And then you can also, this is more recent work from Will, you can learn continuous events, right? So you can learn, so pick up and put down are a little bit more discrete because there's a finite start of an action and finite end. But a similar method, an SME Sage based method, can also learn more continual events, which is when the object has been, the robot has to push or pull different objects instead of like picking up and put down. So the results are general. This is super cool because the theory of analogical reasoning and generalization came from cognitive science, right? It was formulated there. And then we were able to bring it into a robotics system, and it's working pretty well. So that to me is a strength of a theory, like a strength of a good theory, is that when we build systems with it, those systems have the behaviors that we intend them to have. So here's the final vision of what I think the system would be. We want a system that can reason at multiple levels. At the most bottom level, this is the most concrete reasoning layer. Here you're reasoning with images and voltages, inverse kinematics. Then there is the metacognitive goal reasoning layer, which is thinking about which goals to take, what to do next. And then at the top is the most abstract conceptual layer that's focused on learning different concepts from interaction, right? And we want all of these layers to operate in tandem such that a robot is able to learn. So this is the full vision. It's implemented for these small tabletop settings. We are currently thinking of, taking such systems to more complex settings when they're real robots, more confusing, noisy spaces in which these robots have to live. And we want to study both parts of interactive learning, right? We want to look at agents that learn from humans, but we also want to see if the agents can teach humans, right? And use similar representations to teach them. All right, I'm at the end of my talk. Thank you for listening to me. A lot of people contributed not just ideas, but code, data, and difficult studies, especially thanks to Will, who helped us integrate SME and Sage in the rest of the system, and Preeti, who ran and analyzed the study. And then I'll just pause here. Want to briefly summarize what I talked about. I know that I threw a lot of concepts at you, but hopefully you found them interesting. So we talked about the problem of interactive task learning. It's a challenge. It's an interdisciplinary challenge, right? You need to understand humans. You need to understand AI. You need to understand human AI interaction, and you need to put all of this together. And it's only then we can build agents or artificial intelligence systems that can interact well with humans, right? It studies multiple AI problems together. It requires, a integrated architecture that can bring different cognitive models in a single systemic way. And then we talked about AILEEN, and I went through how AILEEN uses analogical reasoning and generalization to learn from linguistic human interaction. There's some papers that might be interesting to read. And again, there's my contact information. I would encourage you to think about this work and reach out to me if you find it interesting, or if in general you find other parts of my research interesting, because I have different work in different domains. I've done health, I've done sustainable transportation, and augmented reality, and all of those domains have the same flavor, where we want to develop systems that can collaborate well with humans. So if you find any of that interesting, I would love to talk to you as well. All right, thank you, everybody. Hopefully this is not like the middle of the night for most of you.